guys, so I thought I would sit down to film a chatty video today, or tonight, because it's pitch black outside, all about the favourite authors I've discovered in 2019. So these are all authors that I've generally read for the first time this year, excluding one, but I'll explain that in context at the time, and that I've read multiple books by, so it can't just be somebody that I read one book by and adored. Therefore it may be quite different from my end of the year absolute favourite books, since those focus on individual books, and that I've enjoyed all of those books, have sort of developed a relationship with that author's writing. They've become a bit of an auto-buy, or someone I'm keeping my eye on kind of everything they bring out in the future, because they have become a new favourite. Seems pretty self-explanatory, right? When I started making the list for this video, I actually started wishing I'd filmed a similar video at the end of 2018, because I think it's quite a fun concept. However, I then realised that it would probably just be one big long video about Juliet Marillier, because that's when I discovered her. And I did do a video all about Juliet Marillier. So I basically already did this video for 2018, it's just they only had one author in it. This one has a few more though, so I'm gonna, get started and jump straight in. The first author is the one that, like I mentioned, I did read a book by before this year. Controversial. And that is Grace Draven. So I read my first book by Grace Draven late in 2018, and I think I read it so late in the year that it kind of missed out on being in my favourites video. I hadn't had enough time to process it. And I recently reread it, and that's Radiance. So I've kind of returned already to that story within the space of a year, which is quite a big deal, I think, in terms of my reading. I don't often do that, and it means I must have loved something about it, and it must have meant something to me, and it did. And after really enjoying Radiance, I continued on my Grace Draven journey throughout the year. I ended up reading the sequel to Radiance, which is Eidolon, book 2. I'm still hoping that there is going to be a book 3 at some point. I also read Phoenix Unbound, and Entreat Me. Entreat Me was another absolute favourite. It was a retelling of Beauty and the Beast, and one of the best Beauty and the Beast retellings I read, and I also enjoyed Phoenix Unbound. These are all fantasy novels, fantasy romances with kind of varying levels of plot outside of the romance, if that makes sense. Radiance for me is a romance novel. It is in a fantastical world, and there are some background plots happening, but it's not about them. It's about the relationship between Brishan and Ildiko, and everything else is secondary and much smaller in the story. But I love them all in their own way, and they all still have that quintessential fantasy romance that I've learnt to love and expect from Grace Draven. She, like I said, has become like a bit of an auto-read person for me, because I just reread Radiance as well. I am planning on starting another series that she's written that I haven't read yet, because I'm really in the mood. I'm also super excited for the sequel to Phoenix Unbound, which comes out in 2020. I thought it came out in 2019, but in December, that's why I didn't mention it in my 2020 releases video, but it does come out in 2020, I think, and that's Dragon Unleashed. And it's like a sequel but companion novel to Phoenix Unbound, because it's a different main character, but it's a main character we met in book 1, and like the title implies, it involves dragons, so I'm so excited about that. And I've just, I don't know how to talk about an author that I've fallen in love with. Fantasy romance, and in particular with Radiance, which I mentioned recently as well because I reread it, it is just the most healthy, respectful relationship I've ever read in a romance book or any other book, and unfortunately not actually that common. What I found throughout my time reading Grace Draven is that she is reliable. She always delivers what I'm expecting to get from her books. She always does a really good job at building up her relationships. There's often slightly unique elements in terms of what I read elsewhere in romance. Like Entreat Me is a romance between, and this shouldn't sound as controversial as it is, like a woman in her late 30s and a man maybe in his like 40s, as opposed to, a lot of romances which are about like people in their early 20s, which is fine, but sometimes it's nice to see the difference in a developing relationship between people who have gone through slightly different things in their life or at different stages in their life. In Entreat Me, both the characters have actually previously been married and are both widowers, so I think it offers something a little bit different in terms of fantasy romance, which, like I said, can often just be about early 20s or late teens characters. So I really enjoy that about her books, and I can't wait to read more by her in 2020. I'm not sure what else I'm meant to say. Whilst we're talking about romance, I'm going to mention Tessa Dare. Tessa Dare writes period romance novels set in the 1800s. The way I've been describing these to friends when I recommend them is they're like Jane Austen, but like a little bit feistier and a little bit sexier. I don't know if that's how you describe them, but that's kind of how they come across to me. They are so witty. Tessa Dare has such a brilliant sense of humour, which actually I think is something very true of Jane Austen as well. There is also a lot of comedy in Jane Austen novels, and Tessa Dare's novels are hilarious. Sometimes comedy's a little bit more obvious than, say, Jane Austen. I'm not saying it's exactly the same in terms of humour, but I enjoy a humorous relationship romance in a Regency setting, I've discovered. That's something I really enjoy, and I read so many books by Tessa Dare this year. I'm not even sure I can remember all the books by Tessa Dare I read to tell you about. I read the first book in her Castles Ever After series, which is Romancing the Duke. I read all but one of the books in the Spindle Cove series, including all of the novellas, which I think is quite a few. I can't remember exactly, but including the novellas, I swear it's something like 5 or 6 books. And I also read 3 books in the Girl Meets Duke series, which is only going to be 4 books and the 4th one isn't out yet, as well as a standalone novella. So all in all, I think I read around 10 books by Tessa Dare, which is gonna mean I love an author, right? And she really has opened my eyes to the historical romance genre. I think actually she's done a lot for romance for me and kind of convincing me that I am and could be a romance reader when I wasn't really, especially outside of fantasy, and I have absolutely fallen in love with her books, each and every one of them. It's hard for me to pick, but I think if I was going to recommend anywhere to start or a favourite, it would be go with the Spindle Cove series, because I love the whole premise of the Spindle Cove. Spindle Cove is a seaside community where one more aristocratic woman has set up a community for women like her that are a little bit misfit, a little bit odd, that don't quite fit into society's expectations for young women. That might just be because they want to be a geologist or an intellectual. It might be because they're so shy that they can't even speak to men at balls. Their parents might just think, oh, they're never going to get married, they need to go to Spindle Cove because they're a bit of an embarrassment, or something more scandalous might have happened to them and they might have had an affair, and that means that they need to kind of hide from society. Whatever reason, kind of brings all these women together and gives them a place where they can feel safe and amongst other women who aren't going to judge them and express themselves. And then of course, in each book, a different woman falls in love, but always with a man that can accept her for who she is outside of what society necessarily expects. And I love that, and I love the Spindle Cove series. And I also think if you're somebody that's a little bit dubious about the kind of historical romance or romance genre in general, if you're going to try anyone, try Tessa Dare, give her a chance, she may be for you, and it is just such good, fun, positive escapism. We then have an author I have only read 2 books by in this year, but she only has 2 books. or 2 novels anyway. So I've read her back catalogue, and therefore I feel like I can say she's somebody that has become a favourite based on what she's written, and someone I will automatically read in the future, and that's Naomi Booth. So I read 2 books by Naomi Booth, which are the 2 books that she has out, and that is Sealed, a literary dystopian epidemic horror novel that was brilliant, and The Lost Art of Sinking, which is more of a contemporary novel about a young girl that develops an addiction to choking herself in different forms, that stems from her childhood and then continues into her present as a young woman. It's really fascinating. Sealed is definitely my favourite of the 2, but I still very much appreciated Naomi Booth's prose in both books. She's a gorgeous writer, absolutely stunning, and she uses her gorgeous writing to really unsettle the reader, which I love. I love a kind of literary horror novel where the language itself just kind of creeps into your bones and stays there for a little while. I felt really, really unnerved when reading Sealed, but it has stuck with me. I have thought about it on a regular basis and recommend it to a lot of people. Sealed in more detail is set in a near future. It's not quite definitive what the time period is in which a disease has started spreading across the world, where people's orifices basically just are sealed over by skin. So it could be their ears, it could be their mouth, it could be their nose, their eyes, one or more of those different parts of their body just sort of growing extra skin. And obviously, say for example that's your mouth and your nose, that's going to suffocate you. There are procedures that have been developed to deal with this, and if you have the skin removed, it doesn't seem to grow back. However, based in a world where you have to pay for your healthcare, not everyone can afford that, so people are dying. And it seems to be getting worse. However, not everybody is willing to acknowledge that it's getting worse. They just think, oh, it's just another disease. Our protagonist, however, becomes obsessed with it. And her obsession partially stems with her own kind of mental health connected to a pregnancy that she's going through, that she's quite uncertain of, in a relationship she's in that she's quite uncertain of. But equally, it seems based in something more, and you as a reader are kind of unsure what's going on. How bad really is this? Is her paranoia simply in her head, or is there a reason for this? And it's so fascinating, and it explores a lot of emotional issues as well as having this kind of creepy dystopian pandemic side to it. I then want to mention an author that's a little bit unique for this list, because although I read 3 books by her, they were all in the same series, but I love them so much that it would be wrong of me to not include her in this new favourite authors video, and that is Effie Calvin. So this is the only physical book I own by her, which is The Queen of Eothlaria. I own the 2 sequels to this on Kindle edition, and this is the Tales of Inthea series, although I will mention that although this is a series, book 2 follows different protagonists. Book 3 then returns to the protagonists of book 1. So you do get different characters and different storylines, and then the characters from book 2 crop up in book 3, even though they're not the protagonists anymore, and I'm waiting with bated breath for book 4, which I'm so excited for because I love every single character, whether they were the leads in this book or book 2. And it was so funny because I was nervous going into book 2, as I often am with series that follow different characters, because if you've fallen in love with 2 characters like I did in book 1, you are nervous about reading a book in that world that doesn't follow them, because you want to know more about the characters that you just fell in love with. However, I loved book 2 as much, if not more. Like, that was just giving me 2 more characters to absolutely adore, and all the better because in both book 1 and book 2, where we follow the beginnings of new relationships, they are both female-female romances, which I have been on the hunt for all year. I have found some absolutely amazing examples of, and this is one of my favourites. So in this book we follow 2 princesses who are part of an arranged marriage to form an alliance between their 2 kingdoms, which I thought was such a unique concept, because this magical world essentially embraces all sort of forms of relationship. It has its problems, but homophobia is not one of them, and sometimes that's what you need. As much as I think it's important to read about the struggles of the LGBTQ+ community, sometimes it's just nice to read a book where it's not a frickin' problem, right? Like, it's comforting, and that's so true of this series. Then in book 2 we actually follow a kind of warrior type character from a band of warriors that you kind of learn the context for in book 1, because there's a really complicated magical religious system in this world that's very tied together, and there's lots of different gods and goddesses and different kind of cults, in the same way that Greek mythology has lots of different cults. And in book 2 we have one of these warriors that serves one of those gods, as well as a goddess, but who's like a minor goddess that people have stopped worshipping, and their relationship, brilliant. Again, love the relationships in all of these books. Each character helps the other one grow in some way or another, and kind of embrace themselves and who they are. And if I didn't already mention, there's also dragons, which obviously I'm always here for. Those are all of the authors I'm going to mention in this video though. I wanted to keep it short and sweet and really highlight those that kind of stand out above the rest. Adored each and every single one of the books I read by these authors. Will be reading everything they release in the future, as well as some of their back catalogue for those that have written a little bit more that I haven't got into yet. Cannot wait for all of that. So pleased to have been introduced to them. And like I mentioned, there were so many other books and authors I enjoyed this year and I would consider favourites, but I maybe just didn't read multiple books by them this year. So do look out for my top books of 2019, which will be going up nearer the end of this month or the beginning of January, which I've already made my list for and has like 15 books in it. So you will get a fair few recommendations in there. But I would love to know if you have discovered any new favourite or auto-buy or auto-read authors this year. Authors that you just cannot wait to read more by in 2020. Do let me know. And until next time, happy reading. I'll see you all again soon. Bye guys!